Happy Friday noon, and welcome to our second study on the book of Philippians. Uh, appreciate those of you who were present last week who let us know that you were while I was talking for the duration of that initial study. I had no idea if anybody would be listening to me. That shouldn't have bothered me since I've been a pastor all these years and raised two teenage children by myself. However, now and again, it's nice to know. We're starting with Philippians chapter 1, verse 3 today. The handout from last week will apply for our study today, and we will go all the way through verse 11 today. This is a wonderful, upbeat thing for Paul to say. I thank my God every time I remember you. So keep in mind that he had a very warm, happy relationship with the Corinthian congregation. They loved him, he loved them, and that comes through frequently. It's going to come through several times very clearly today. But I thank my God. I thank my God every time I remember you. Such a kind and uplifting thing to say to someone or to some group of people. The word that he uses here for I thank, you see on the screen right now. You see it in a verb form for I give thanks. Evcharisto or Eucharisto. You see the Greek on top, the English transliteration on the bottom line left. Is the same word from which we get our word Eucharist or communion or Lord's Supper, which would be an interesting study for another time. But Paul says, I give thanks to God every single time I remember you. And then he continues in verse 4. I am reading from the New Revised Standard, as I usually do in Bible study, which is not the translation that you're seeing on the screen. But verse 4, Philippians 1:4, from the New Revised Standard Version reads, always, in every prayer of mine for all of you, I pray with joy. The Greek word for joy is chara. You see it on the screen. Greek on the first line, English on the second line. And I think we can translate it as happy exuberance, which makes a whole lot of sense. The word joy, yeah, that's what it means. But keep in mind that Paul's in jail, or at least under house arrest. And he's getting increasingly under the skin of the emperor, who within a year or so, two, probably at the most, will pronounce the death penalty for Paul. I wanted you to see, using the English words, it's very comparable in Greek, that the root word, both for joy and grace, is the same. Chara, joy, charis, grace. Pressing on now with verse 5, which is an extension of the sentence we're in the middle of here. It is not a new sentence. Paul has just said, I pray for you with joy. Now verse 5, because of, that is, I'm praying for you with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. That would be from the first day that he presented them the gospel, or the first day that they accepted the gospel. Two big words here of importance. The word for partnership, which is koinonia or koinonia, community, and gospel, evangelion or euangelion, which is good news or gospel. Hugely important words in the New Testament in the developing Jesus movement. Evangelion, euangelion, became not only the word used to describe this glorious news that Jesus proclaimed that centered in God's unconditional love for all people, but also became the word used to describe this brand new genre of literature, gospel, that carried the stories of the teachings, I should say the stories and the teachings from the life of Jesus. Gospel. You see the first two letters, epsilon, upsilon, in English, transliterate out to EU. Anytime we have a Greek derived word in English with the letters EU in front of it, it means good, something good. Euthanasia means the good death, for example. Here we have U, or F, they would pronounce it in modern Greek today for pronunciation purposes. Euangelion or Evangelion, meaning good news. Angelon, news, message, the same root for messenger, which is angel. Very fascinating combination of things bring that word together. And now we're at verse 6, new sentence beginning, and I am thinking that we will not get through verse 11 again this week. I feel like multiple professors I've had through the years who promised more at every lecture than we could possibly get through. But anyway, here we go with verse 6, which is very important in my life, and a beautiful thought on Paul's part. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you, that's a plural you, of course, will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. The closing of this chapter of human history. That's the day of Jesus Christ. This may be a good place to remind ourselves that the Apostle Paul was blind for the entirety of his Christian ministry. And that meant, among other things, that though he was an outstanding scholar, he was no longer doing his own reading or writing. So artistic representations of Paul writing by himself are inaccurate. Paul dictated the letters that we have from him to various amanuenses, secretaries, and since, as we discovered last week in the very first verse of Philippians, Paul and Timothy, chances are Timothy, already a protege earlier in Paul's ministry, was serving as his amanuensis, his secretary. Paul's arrest in Rome early on was probably a house arrest where he had access to some visitors with some frequency. When it came closer to the time for his execution, when that was actually established, he was moved to another more restricted prison. And there's actually some archaeological work done on that particular place. But Philippians was dictated by the Apostle Paul, the blind, mostly blind Apostle Paul, to his younger colleague and protege, Timothy, who visited him frequently in his imprisonment in or near Rome. Paul's theological default about what was going to happen when had been purely apocalyptic. When he first began writing, which is now 10 years ago from when this is being written, 3 or so years after his public ministry began, Paul was extremely tied into the idea that Jesus was coming back into the world to end human history as it had been known any moment. And Paul's earliest writing, which is now First Thessalonians, that's what we call that writing. First Thessalonians was very much filled with this. Jesus is coming back any moment. Hurry, don't bother with this, don't bother with that, and so forth. Now, 10 years later, Paul has got a challenge on his hands, namely, Jesus hadn't come back in 10 years, and things didn't seem a whole lot different than they had 10 years earlier. In fact, they seemed worse, and yet no Jesus breaking into human history to change even horrible things like the way Rome was treating him and followers of Jesus, for example. So, yeah, but that's his theological default, the day of Jesus Christ. Now, I think in an adapted way, Paul had to face the fact, and had to face the fact, that there are closures to challenges and episodes and so forth that that Jesus' example and God's energy cause us to take on short of the ending of the world. There's a closure point, or some project we undertake reaches its point of fulfillment, and that's the time to stop and call it a day, or call it a career, or call it a lifespan for a church or something like that, or denomination, and that's that. But the energy of God helped initiate it, that got the energy involved to get it going in the minds and hearts of the people who pressed for it and were the powerhouses behind keeping it going. Yeah, there's a time for them and people who followed after them to say, we've done all that can be done here, and this is a closeout. God is with us at the beginning of projects and at the end of projects. Paul's life itself was one of those things. Paul wasn't ready to stop living at the time that he lived. He had much more to do. Certainly, Jesus has had much more to do. It wasn't time to quit on anybody's timetable, except enemies of Paul and Jesus and the Jesus movement. And the church was the church by the time Paul was around. But, the full energy had gone into doing the best they could as the representatives of various aspects of the movement, and so, as Paul will say
Paul
later
had
in
said elsewhere,
so stirringly, yeah, without having to wait for the world to end. Some people leave this world, and they hear God saying when they become a part of the next world, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So, in my experience, having grown up at the Beaver Dam Baptist Church and saying that I wanted to be a preacher when I was 14 years old, and having just, by that point in time, the most wonderful pastor who not only was my mentor but became my friend. He left Beaver Dam Baptist Church and moved to Florida to be the pastor of First Baptist Church in Gainesville while I was in college, and I was just horrified that he was not going to stay closer to Tennessee so that he could be a closer friend and so forth, but nonetheless, that was the situation. When college was finishing up, I wanted to be ordained, and that's a very informal process in Southern Baptist life as compared to American Baptist life and some other denominations. But he drove all the way back up from Gainesville, Florida to Knoxville, Maryville, Tennessee to be the main speaker at my ordination, um, at his own expense. Uh, I didn't have any money. My family didn't have any money. The church was too cheap to pay him, so he drug his wife and two kids up there, tried to work some sort of a vacation into the trip, but it was a huge gift to me and a beautiful sermon. In a letter that he had written just before the ordination service or just after the ordination service, he used this verse that the one who begins something in you, namely God, will be a part of bringing it to completion. And I kind of always live by that. And it doesn't mean God does the work for me. It doesn't mean that God gets me or you out of the tough times or the challenges. But it means that God keeps luring us toward what is wholesome and good and right, and all of that. And that is what brings a project kind of to its conclusion, not necessarily a neat and tidy sort of set of closing words or something to that effect. That's not how historical chapters end appropriately, or life chapters as far as that go. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. I would promise you next week that we'll get through chapter 1, verse 11. Surely we can. I'll try my best. Appreciate your participation. Blessings on you. Take good care of yourselves. Stay safe and protected.